Good to see each one of you here this morning. I'd invite you to open up your Bibles to the book of Genesis, and we'll be looking there in just a moment, Genesis chapter 3. It is getting warmer, and so as is typical, we have a sermon about what we're wearing when it gets warmer. But I want to deal not only with the subject of how much we put on our bodies, but why we do so, how we're thinking as we go about that, and really deal with that in the form of questions that we should be asking when we're deciding what to wear. And I think there are several questions. We probably won't cover all that needs to be asked, but I think maybe some primary questions, some primary thought processes we should be having. And then, as the lesson goes along, give more definition to those questions, or maybe more contemplation to those questions. So, as we're thinking about that, as we're thinking about modesty and what we wear, I want to start with the question in Genesis chapter 3, or that begins to be addressed in Genesis chapter 3, the question of, am I naked? So, the question starts with a premise that there is something that can be defined as nakedness, that the thing defined as nakedness is not no clothes at all, and that in Genesis chapter 3, where we begin to discuss this question, this is one of it is, in fact, the first moral question that comes to humanity. For the first question of good and evil. When they knew good and evil, the first thing they recognized is that they were naked, and they sought out a solution to that problem. But we get additional information, because as they sought out a solution, it tells us that they saw that they were naked, verse 7 of Genesis chapter 3. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. So we see the problem. The problem is nakedness. The solution is cover the nakedness up. But verse 8 then says, they heard the sound of Yahweh walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh God in the midst of the trees of the garden. Yahweh God called to man and said to him, where are you? And he said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. So I hid. So this is the third component. Recognize we're naked. The solution is to cover it up. And you can start covering your body and still be naked. So we haven't learned everything about nakedness, but we've learned some pretty important things right here in Genesis 3, that we don't want to be naked, that you can cover up some of your body and still be naked, and that the solution, again, is to cover it all the way up. Now, as we go on through Scripture, we have places like Exodus chapter 28 and verse 42, where as God is describing the clothing of priests, one of the functions of one of the pieces of clothing is to cover the priest's nakedness. And it gives us a little bit of a description of what nakedness is. You shall make for them linen undergarments, he says, to cover their bare flesh, or cover their nakedness. They shall reach from the loins even to the thighs. Now, this is an explicit description. This isn't God using this as an aside. He's explicitly saying, here, make this piece of clothing to cover up this part of the body, which is nakedness. But then, and we're not going to go into all of this, let me just say, if you're here and this is the first time you're hearing these sorts of things, I would recommend you to go to our website. There are sermons after sermons describing this part of the sermon in far more detail than we're going to go into today. But as you go throughout the rest of the Old Testament, and particularly in the prophets, nakedness continues over and over to be described. And it's usually not like this, where God is saying, here's nakedness, cover it up. But rather, it's described in terms of the shame that is being brought upon the people, that they're being exposed, their nakedness is being exposed. And as it describes that, again, body parts. And so God is describing for us what is nakedness. And so if you wanted to come up with a good definition of nakedness, you can walk through the Old Testament and you can see all the things God describes as naked, and you can get a pretty good idea that God generally, when he wants nakedness covered, starts at the shoulders and goes down to at least the knees. And so it's not that complicated. Now, the complication is, do I care if I'm naked? Do I have the same sort of shame that Adam and Eve had? And as we live in a society that, as Paul describes of the Gentiles in his day, where it suppresses the truth and unrighteousness, one of the things that we suppress is that natural inclination of shame when we are naked. So we may have to relearn that process. We may have to relearn what nakedness is. But I think we can. I think the Old Testament provides us ample descriptions so that we can come away with an accurate depiction of what's nakedness, and that we can cover that. Well, secondly, the next question, let me say it that way, that we should ask is, am I modest? Now, this is distinct from the question of, am I naked? Naked is just a question of, are the body parts covered? But you can be covered, your nakedness can be covered, and yet not really be modest. And so we see, for instance, over in 1 Timothy chapter 2, which is the place that this word shows up with the description of clothing and is most frequently referenced. We're talking about modesty. This would be the most explicitly pointed passage concerning that, along with 1 Peter 3, where he says, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, with modesty and self-restraint, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly clothing, but rather by means of good works as is proper for women professing godliness. Now, without even going into the definitions of the word modest here, you can see right before that it's got this word proper. We know what that means. Appropriate, right? So what this involves then is some assessment of the environment, right? What is appropriate clothing? So we got to look around us and see what that looks like. And that's going to change depending on what kind of activity we're engaged in. Is there some sort of formality to the thing that we're doing? You know, where we are, when we're living, time and place, all of those things come into it. And I think because it involves that sort of assessment, some people think that there's no real authority here. I want to suggest something to you, that God considers those kinds of assessments as authoritative. God considers what is going on around you, and the fact that that will change over time and place, he considers that authoritative, and he gives commands based on that kind of assessment. And so, we'll talk about this more in just a minute. Sometimes people will say, well, if you can't come up with a precise definition, maybe we can't be as precise as naked. You can't come up with a precise definition, then there's really no definition. Well, then God's saying nothing here. Paul's saying nothing here. But that's not true. He has specific ideas in mind. And the specifics of Paul's day wouldn't precisely translate to our day and time, though there would be some corollaries, obviously. But as he's talking about this, what sorts of things should we be considering? Well, first of all, appropriateness. I just talked about that. What kind of activity, what kind of formality is there? In Matthew chapter 22, and beginning in verse 11, Jesus is telling the parable. He's in the midst of a parable about a wedding feast, and guests being invited to that feast and so forth. And there are those who not only don't respond to the invitation, but even mistreat those who are inviting them. He invites others from the main highways, it says, those who are not worthy. And so they bring those in. It says both good and evil, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. Verse 10, when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man who was not dressed in wedding clothes. And he said to him, friend, how do you come in here without wedding clothes? And the man was speechless. And the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot and throw him into outer darkness, in that place where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. Now, I want you to think, all right, first of all, I know somebody who especially maybe doesn't like this sermon. Maybe there's somebody listening and thinking, I don't like the direction this is going to go. That's not the point of that parable. It's absolutely not the point of the parable. The point of the parable is not dress up for weddings. But I want to say to you that Jesus can't make the point of the parable if you don't understand that you ought to dress up for weddings. You see, it's built on the premise that the listener would go, well, we know what wedding clothes are. And we know what would happen if you showed up to an event hosted by a king, not dressed like you were supposed to. Like, this wouldn't be like, well, what on earth is the king doing that for? They would have been like, yeah, that's what that looks like. And so Jesus could rely on a generally accepted concept of appropriate, modest dress. It is a sad state of affairs that we cannot rely on the same thing. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be there. We should have a sense that there's an appropriateness for various occasions. Now, continuing on those thought processes, it's not just that we look around and whatever everybody else is wearing, we wear too, because one of the things that Paul is doing as they're looking around in 1 Timothy 2 and in 1 Peter chapter 3, as they're looking around, one of the things that they're going to see, especially in first century Rome, is some wild ostentation, right? They're going to see women who made their hair into absolute sights to see. In France, in sort of the period leading up to the French Revolution, one of the things that caused the French Revolution was the ostentation. They would put sugar in their hair to get it to be very large. Women would make bird cages out of their hair and put actual birds in their hair. And it was just a way to go around and say, look how much money I have. That was happening in Rome too. People would grind gold up into powder and put gold into their hair. That's how wealthy I am. I can use gold as my hair product. And so that's ostentatious. That's the sort of thing that Paul's saying, don't do that. And so what he's preaching here, in addition to appropriateness, is practice some self-control. Practice some sobriety. When you see that sort of thing, if we look and we see that sort of thing, and I think in terms of, I don't know if you've ever looked up Met Gala. It is wild. It is our version of all of this. People show up, and they're showing up to be seen, and they show up like, how can I be the craziest dressed person in the room? And I have looked at those pictures merely for entertainment sometimes, like what on earth? And so you've got this picture of, I'm going to draw the most attention to myself. That's the sort of thing Paul's saying, don't do that. So he uses this word self-restraint. Over in Acts chapter 26 and in verse 25, that word is translated as sobriety. When Paul says, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. The word sober there is our word self-control. And so that's what I think of when I think of these people who dress like, are you out of your mind? Because that's what it looks like. You must be crazy. No, I want to be looked at as somebody who is the sober person in the room, right? The person who has some self-control and doesn't just dress a certain way because I can afford to, because I can dress that way. It also, I think, involves an additional consideration that is connected to nakedness. And that is the idea of being sexually provocative. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 9, 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 9, it says, see to it that this authority of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Where someone sees you who have knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be built up to eat things sacrificed to idols? There is a clothing, there has always been a clothing that is meant to draw not just attention, but particularly sexual attention to someone. Of course, in Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 25, it's describing this woman of the world. Do not desire the evil woman, verse 24. It says, do not desire her beauty in your heart, nor let her capture you with her eyelids. Now, other places in Proverbs that will talk about the attire of a harlot. In most instances, I think what we would say is the attire of the harlot automatically is a revealing of nakedness. And that can be the case, but I think it's not always the case. I think sometimes we can dress in ways that do cover nakedness and yet have that alluring, the point is to allure. The point is sexual in nature. And so that's what we want to avoid. We're not trying to accomplish that. And along these lines, I want to suggest to you that sometimes we borrow the world's terms and then try to somehow apply that to modesty. So you might have heard someone say, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I don't think entirely tongue-in-cheek. I think people really mean this in some ways. They say, modest is hottest. And that's trite, I know. But it's not just trite. It's wrong. When the world says someone is hot, they don't mean this person is lovely and beautiful. They mean they are sexually alluring. That's what that terminology is referring to. Modesty is not that, right? You know, people will say, you know, my wife, she dresses modestly, but she's, you know, hot or whatever, and people want to just be provocative in the way that they talk. I don't want that. I'm not looking for hot. I'm looking for modest, beautiful, and I want to add one more question here. I want to be lovely. I want my wife to be lovely. I want my daughters to be lovely. This is a very different term that the world would use. The world would say sexy, which goes even a step further. It's not what I'm looking for. I am looking for loveliness. Now, on this last point, this is not usually a question that comes into our discussions of modesty, and I think there are several reasons for that. I think we think it really doesn't matter what you look like so long as you are covered and so long as you are, you know, within the bounds of appropriateness. I think this obviously, loveliness is going to have a lot of overlap with modesty. But what I want you to consider is the concept that beauty is a thing that God speaks of in objective terms. We think beauty is infinitely subjective. We say things like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We say, somebody says, oh, I think that's so beautiful. And somebody says, well, that's your opinion. It doesn't appeal to me that much. But when God speaks of beauty, he speaks of it being yes or no. In Psalm 45, beginning in verse 13, it says, the king's daughter is all glorious within her chamber. Her clothing is interwoven with gold. She will be led to the king in embroidered work. The virgins, her companions who follow her, will be brought to you. They will be led forth in gladness and rejoicing. They will enter into the king's palace. Here, God wants to describe a picture of a bride being adorned and glorified to come into the presence of a king in beauty to behold. It ruins the picture if someone goes, well, I'm just not that into embroidery. No, the idea is God is saying, these are beautiful clothes. And if you say, well, I don't think that's beautiful, then that says more about you than the clothes, because these are beautiful clothes. over in Isaiah chapter 61. Isaiah chapter 61 and in verse 10. I will rejoice greatly in Yahweh. My soul will rejoice in my God. He has clothed me with garments of salvation. He has wrapped me with a robe of righteousness. So there's clothing being associated with eternal qualities. But then what does he connect that to? He says, as a bridegroom decks himself with a headdress, as a bride adorns herself with jewels. When you go to a wedding, this is a place where there's a particular emphasis on loveliness. And a bride means to look lovely. And a groom means to look lovely. On that day of all days, if you say to a woman, if I'm having this conversation with someone, they say, well, what is loveliness? The day you get married, you'll know. Because you'll want to achieve it. And you won't act like it's some subjective thing that nobody can know. Over in Exodus chapter 28. Remember I said earlier that God made, that we see there in Exodus 28, God made these linen trousers to cover up. That's their purpose. That's the function of that clothing, is to cover up nakedness. But look in verse 2 of Exodus 28. I love this. You shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother, for glory and for beauty. And he says it again as he concludes the description down in verse 40. For Aaron's sons you shall make tunics, you shall make sashes for them, and you shall make caps for them, for glory and for beauty. As we look at the considerable descriptions of the priestly clothing, and we say, what's that for? And what's that for? And they are symbolic of various things. But I tell you one thing that they are is to make the priests beautiful. People did not need to look at the priest and think, ugh. They ought to look at it and see something pleasant to behold, something lovely. Ezekiel chapter 16. In Ezekiel chapter 16, and there in verse 10 beginning, again, we come to embroidery, but a great many other things God says he clothed Israel with. He says, I also clothed you with embroidered cloth, put sandals of porpoise skin on your feet. I wrapped you with fine linen and covered you with silk. I also adorned you with ornaments and put bracelets on your hands and a necklace around your neck. And I put a ring in your nose and earrings in your ears and a splendid crown on your head. Thus you were adorned with gold and silver, and your clothing was of fine linen, silk, and embroidered cloth, and you ate fine flour, honey, and oil. So you were exceedingly beautiful and advanced to royalty. Again, God gives a picture. And he gives a picture that's meant for the audience to say, yes, that would be beautiful. That's what that would look like. And again, we have some degree of variation from one place to another as to what that would look like. But that doesn't mean that it has no meaning, that it is completely in the eye of the beholder. One more passage along these lines in Proverbs 31 is it's describing this woman who is of the greatest of virtue. The woman of wisdom lived out here in Proverbs 31. It says she is not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed, and it says with scarlet. Now it's interesting to me that it doesn't say her household are clothed with warm coverings, but rather it chooses really an element of style, that she has clothed her family with fine clothing. That's what scarlet would be, right? She's clothed her family with fine clothing. She makes coverings for herself, and her clothing is fine linen and purple. Again, making statements not just that she has made herself clothing, she's made herself a burlap sack to put over herself. No, she's made fine clothes. She looks nice. She looks lovely. This is a woman who looks in a way that is consistent with the life that she lives. She is lovely. Now, what do we do with that? I think we live in a day and age where we live in a fully postmodern world, where any attempt to say, here are standards, people will say, unless, and this is kind of modernism combined with postmodernism, because modernism says, unless you can put it in a test tube and measure it, it's not really true. And then postmodernists come along and take them out the word and say, unless you can tell me precisely what it is that you're talking about, then this is an irrelevant detail to my life. But I don't think it is. I think so long we've gone along, and our children grow up and they go through the phases of rebellion. And one of the things that they want to rebel against is standards that have not been communicated with precision. And they want to test those waters and test those boundaries. And so they begin wearing things that are not only maybe testing the bounds of nakedness or modesty. And nakedness, maybe we can come in and say, you're going to have these parts of your body clothed. But they test also the bounds of loveliness. And I want to suggest to you, a lot of parents don't know what to do about it. Their kids start wearing goth clothing, dyeing their hair colors and piercing all parts of their body and maybe even getting a tattoo. And they're like, I don't like it, but I don't know what to say about it. Here's what you say about it. It is ugly. And I do not want to adorn myself as someone who bears God's image in a way that is ugly. I want to point, like the priests of old, to a beautiful God by representing him with beauty. When you choose some of these paths, what you are saying, you are adorning yourself like the goth movement. You're adorning yourself with death, with the colors of death, and maybe even some very explicit paraphernalia of death. Is this what we want to communicate to the world? Is this what we want to say about the God that we serve? Men and women have pressed the boundaries of what says, I am a woman or I am a man. And women say, I want to wear combat boots. Why? Because I like it. Yes, but is it lovely to see a woman in combat boots? It is not. You are pressing against something instead of saying, how do I communicate the loveliness that God has given me? How do I adorn that? How do I adorn the God who made me? That is the way the Bible talks about dress in marriage, is that the bride is not, we think in terms of this is the bride saying, this is my day. It's not the way the Bible talks about it. That they are adorning themselves for each other. That she is making herself the glory of the bridegroom. And so we are making ourselves the glory of God. Can I say one more thing about these three questions before we move on? None of these questions are focused on your preferences. All of them are asking questions about external realities. We start and usually finish the question of my clothing with my preferences. And we think in terms of, I want to express myself, my personality. I want to express who I am in my clothing. That's what clothing's all about. It's what the retailers of clothing, express who you are, your differences, your uniqueness by buying the clothes off the shelf that there are 100 other of as well. But they certainly don't say, come and buy our clothes so that you can express glory of other people and of the God you serve. But start to finish, that's our mindset. That's the mindset of a Christian. It ought to be. That we are thinking, what does this say outward? Not just, what does this say to me? And how does this give me pleasure? Well, an important element of these questions is that they are asked in order. I listed them in the order of primary, secondary, and, to use a little used word, tertiary concern. None of these questions are unimportant, but they are not all equally important. This is what Jesus is speaking of in Matthew chapter 3, beginning in verse 23, where he talks about speaking to the Pharisees. He tells them that they have neglected the weightier matters of the law. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, who strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also." People read this and they think what Jesus is saying is eating gnats is fine. Just don't eat camels. What he's actually saying is that neither one is good, but you're being very absurd because you eat camels and strain out gnats. It is true that modesty is a heart issue, but Jesus doesn't say clean the inside of the dish and leave the outside a mess. He says clean the inside so that it will be in compliance with what you're trying to show on the outside. Incidentally, they weren't trying to walk around immodestly dressed and so forth. They were actually trying to present a clean image. And what Jesus says is bring along the inside to that, not the other way. Or don't cross them over and say, well, it's okay so long as the inside's clean. No, clean the whole thing, inside and out. And I'm afraid a lot of people go around in their dress saying it doesn't matter what the outside looks like so long as the inside is pure. So in other words, what you're saying is it doesn't matter if I'm sending out an external message that is not true of who I am. That's the very opposite of what Peter and Paul are saying in 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Peter chapter 3. They're saying that there should be consistency, that our external message should be consistent with the internal message. So, these degrees of importance. Yes, you should start with the inside. But coming back to these questions, I would also say that there's a primary concern. The first concern, when we're thinking about clothing, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, what's the first question? The first question is, am I covered? Not am I stylish? Right? Am I covered? And I could just illustrate this, but, as I have before. If you are standing naked in a room and someone walks in on you, your first thought is, let me pick out something stylish. It is let me grab something, anything, to cover up. We'll worry about style later. So we understand that concept. Then, once we've answered the question of, am I covered? Now we can ask the question of, is this the appropriate thing to be covered with? And then we can ask the question of, having covered myself, having made sure I'm appropriate, is this also beautiful? Is it something that glorifies the God who made me? And I think it's that order that we ought to ask them in. They are also, they are in order of importance, as I just noted. Luke chapter 14, in verse 25, Jesus talks about our families and about hatred of our families. And I think like this, the ordered nature of honor your father and mother. Yes, but that comes under the ordered command of you shall have no other gods before me. And so what Jesus is dealing with when he says hate father and mother, hate all these other family members, in order underneath love your God. Right? So the first question is, am I being true and faithful to God? The first question is not, am I being faithful to my family? That's a secondary question. And it comes under the primary question. I think that's the same way we need to be asking, am I naked? Am I modest? Am I lovely? Well, I think that all of these questions in this order need to be asked of your closet and of your shopping. Too often, again, we pick a piece of clothing off the shelf and we look at it, and the first question we're asking is one that's not even on the list. Do I like this? Does this make me feel good? Is it cute? Just maybe getting close to one of those questions, but it's not even the first one. The first one, we take it off, does this cover me up? If not, well, there's no other questions to ask, are there? Just put that one back. We ask that of our closet. You need to go into your closet. Does this cover me up? If it doesn't, don't think somehow one day you're going to walk back in and it will have expanded. Go ahead and get rid of it. Like, it doesn't meet the question. But then also ask these other questions. Is this modest? This is one of the problems. There are times where we've gone to the store and we'll see something that is maybe see an Auburn tie. And Amy will go, oh, look at this. And then it's not covering nakedness, right? It's not that problem. But I ask the question, where would I wear that? Like, where am I going to dress up enough to be in a tie and want Auburn to be the thing I dress up in, right? I'm not giving any speeches to Auburn's football team or something. So there's no appropriate place in my mind. For me, there's no appropriate place. See, it doesn't meet that question. Why am I going to buy this? You ever bought things you think, oh, I love that, and then you get it home and it just stays in the closet because there's just nowhere to wear that. And then maybe one day you just say, well, I'm going to wear it anyway. But that's not the path, right? So you just leave that on the shelf at the store. You take it out of your closet. We need to ask those questions. And we need to ask those questions from the standpoint of not just if you're standing still like this. I've told you before, one of the questions I ask my girls when they say, is this modest? I'm like, well, at this very moment it is, but are you planning on sitting down at any point during the day? Right? So we got to ask the questions, like, as you move around, is this going to stay modest? Is this going to stay covering and so forth? And we want to be thoughtful and careful about that. Well, finally, I want to think about this. These are all questions of discernment, all of them. But they are at varying levels of discernment. And I just hit the back button there. Okay. They're varying levels of discernment, varying levels of subjectivity. There is not a lot of subjectivity in the question of, am I naked? There is some. And I say there's some because questions of tightness, questions of precisely where the cutoff is, people are going to have to use some judgment. Even there, though, I would say that what we want to do is take care, right? We're not trying to say, where's the line so I can get right at that. But there is some room for judgment in trying to comply with that first question of, am I naked? There's a little bit more subjectivity to, am I modest? What's the appropriate thing to wear on this occasion? And there's even more on the question of what is lovely. But some subjectivity does not mean infinite subjectivity. And I think that goes back to kind of our modernist mindset. If there's some variability with the answer, then that is not a real truth. We'll just throw out the Proverbs entirely then. Because what the Proverbs deals with is things that are generally true, that you can say are true, even though you can find exceptions to that rule. So, for instance, on the question of, am I lovely? I might not be as dressed as lovely on a day where it's negative 10 degrees outside. I might look more like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man because I'm just trying to keep warm at that point. And so I understand that. Or maybe I'm working in the garden and I've got dirt all over me. And somebody says, are you dressing lovely in it? I will say this even about that. Go back a couple of 100 years and look at what people worked in. One day I was at the Biltmore. We were walking through the Biltmore, and down in the basement, if you've ever been there, it's got the pictures of when they were building this. Look at the workmen. They're all in coats and vests and ties, and they're sawing lumber and chiseling rock. They go to work looking like professional men. There was a man who did gardening, who taught ag where Amy taught school. And one of the things that he liked to say that we both remember to this day, just because your hands are in dirt doesn't mean you have to be dirty. He always wore a suit. And he'd put on his smock and he would go to work and he just looked the part. But he wanted to communicate something to the children that he was teaching. So even there, just a consideration. But I understand there are going to be varying levels. We need to be careful that we don't say to our children, just because there's some variability, just because there's some room for judgment, that all bets are off. And that nobody can say anything about this thing. It may be true that somebody over there can't precisely judge the decisions you make, but let me tell you, God can. He has told you to think about these things. And he will judge you on whether or not you have. None of them, therefore, are completely subjective. I want to leave you with this thought, too. And that is that fathers, and I would add mothers, but fathers need to be developing and sharing their wisdom on this subject. I say fathers particularly because we have passages like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 6, where he's talking about sexual immorality. And you know that as he's saying to these brothers to practice this self-control, he says, do not defraud your brother. He doesn't say your sister. And I think the reason is because there's a man in that woman's life who is responsible for her care. And you are doing him a particular injury. Now, that doesn't mean, well, God doesn't even care about what you're doing to the woman. No, that's not it. But what he's wanting you to think about is, what if somebody did this to your sister, to your wife, to your daughter? What would you think then? And so he puts that man in the place of responsibility. Leviticus chapter 18 does this. As it's going through and talking about the uncovering of the nakedness. Again, sexual sins throughout. Notice again, over and over, that's your father's nakedness. That's your uncle's nakedness. That's your brother's nakedness. When you go and you take this woman, and it doesn't disregard the woman. It says that's her nakedness too. But you are taking this man's nakedness. And so it puts the man into that role, into that responsibility. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 13 says, everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern both good and evil. I think that certainly applies to the area of modesty. Way too many fathers are either afraid or oblivious when it comes to questions of modesty, and particularly with their daughters. I'm not going to say anything about that. I know girls are very sensitive about the clothes that they wear. And particularly when it comes to modesty. I don't want to be the one to say to my daughter, hey, that's a little tight. There's a lot of implications to saying that besides the modesty question, right? And a lot of feelings might come up if I say that. Okay. So I let her go out dressed with shame. Instead of going through that emotional conversation and letting the emotion be between me and her, working through that, letting her know that I'm coming from a place of love and protection, I just send her out without any of that. What I am in that case is lazy and a coward. It's my job. It's my responsibility. And I need to bring my wife. Maybe she doesn't see the things that I see as a man. And that gets into a whole other thing. Oh, you're seeing things, when you bring things up about sexual provocativeness, it's your mind is in the gutter. No, if my mind was in the gutter, I'd keep my mouth quiet and keep staring. I don't want to see it. That's not a mind in the gutter. That's a mind that wants to stay out of the gutter. And so we ought to develop sensibilities, wisdom about these things. Men, let me say this about young ladies. I realize that there are a great many young ladies who are walking around completely naive about the nature of their clothing. I also realize they're not all naive. That's what Proverbs says. But naivete and wickedness are neither one compliments. Proverbs says you need to get over both of those. In the case of a father, you are either naive or you are a coward, and neither one of those is a compliment. What we need to do is gain some courage. Too many fathers are fine with their daughters and perhaps their wives dressing like someone who has sexually experienced, so long as it actually isn't true. But if you go around fine with your daughters looking like they're sexually experienced, pretty soon they will be. And so you have to fight against the thing that leads to the big problem. Don't be like the people in Matthew chapter 5 who are fine with everything that leads up to adultery, just not the adultery itself. I want to add this about boys. Most of what the Bible says about dress, most of the warnings are aimed at women primarily, and I think that's for good reason. There are a lot of reasons women have particular temptations about appearance and so forth. I think some of the other things that I've talked about are difficulties for men. You know, a lot of men are like, what does it matter what it looks like? You need kind of some instruction on that. You need to take care that you dress in appropriate ways. But particularly in times of prosperity like we live in, men have time and leisure to become overly focused on their clothes in ways that are not healthy. And instead of focusing on what is pure and good and lovely, and that is Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, what is pure and good and lovely. Instead of focusing on that, they join in the fashion arms race with the rest of the world. I want to say this, if you are a man, and if you're particularly a young man who is having to be told to cover your nakedness, who is having to be told not to dress so ostentatiously, you are sinning. And I say this not in derision of women, but I want to say this advisedly. You are sinning like a woman. And I think that's part of a soft age that we live in, is that men take on the sins of women, and women take on the sins of men. And so in addition to all the sort of natural tendencies that God has created us with, that we pervert in our own creative order, we go even outside that order and we add sins to what was already a part of our difficulty. And I say that, let me say this, I'm not saying God gave us sinful nature. What I'm saying is God gave us certain desires that we then pervert and use wrongly. Then we go borrow some other inclinations from the opposite sex. Well, in closing, clothing, like all of Christian life, requires a great deal of thoughtfulness. We are a people of lazy thinking. But Christians cannot be lazy thinkers. It requires all the more thought because culture and even Christians are not there to help and support good choices. They are there to affirm us in all of our bad choices. Oh, don't you look so hot? And so we've got to run uphill not just of culture, but even, unfortunately, our brethren. But what we want, what we desire as Christians, I hope, is that we are thinking, how do I reflect glory and honor to God, in whose image we are created? How do I do that in everything I do, including the clothes that I put on in the morning? I want to glorify Him. You don't have to wear the clothing of a priest, but you do have to remember you are a priest. So the principles with which God clothed the priest apply to you as well. If you're not a Christian, you may be thinking, that's an awful lot to think about. Understand what God is doing is not just saying, come follow my rules. He's saying, let me call you out of shame and into glory. It is not just his opinion of glory. He is saying, let me call you to actual, real glory. And so if there's shame that you need to walk away from and heed the call to walk into his glory, his holiness, if there's any way we can help you with that this morning, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?